In 1976, a social psychologist named Russell Middlemist set up a hidden periscope inside a men's public restroom at a university. From a concealed position in the next stall, a Confederate recorded how long it took men to begin urinating and how long the act lasted, depending on whether another person was standing at the next urinal. The study was about personal space. The findings were real, the methodology worked, and it was immediately controversial in ways that had nothing to do with the science. When the paper was published, the debate wasn't about statistical power or measurement validity. It was about something else entirely. Did these men consent to being observed? Did Middlemist have the right to do this, even in service of a legitimate research question? That debate landed in a journal, went back and forth, and never really resolved, but it pointed to something important. Science doesn't operate in an ethical vacuum, and that's what this lecture is all about. It would be easy to treat research ethics as a bureaucratic inconvenience, a checklist you file before the real science begins. But that framing misunderstands where ethics rules come from. They were written in response to specific harms. And let's start with the most extreme case. During World War II, doctors working in Nazi concentration camps conducted experiments on prisoners, without consent, without regard for suffering, often with lethal results. They justified the work as medical science. The subjects had no choice, no knowledge, no protection. When those doctors were tried at Nuremberg in 1947, the tribunal did something that had never been formally done before. It issued a set of principles for what makes human research ethically permissible. The Nuremberg Code said that voluntary consent is absolutely essential, that subjects must be free to withdraw. The experiments must avoid unnecessary suffering, that the expected benefit must be proportionate to the risk. But the Nuremberg Code wasn't enough on its own. In subsequent decades, it emerged that ethically problematic research had continued even in democratic countries. Research involving vulnerable populations who weren't told what they were participating in, who weren't protected from harm. In 1964, the World Medical Association issued the Declaration of Helsinki, a more detailed set of principles specifically for medical and clinical research that has been updated multiple times since. Helsinki addressed things the Nuremberg Code left implicit: the difference between therapeutic and non-therapeutic research, the responsibility of researchers towards participants, the need for independent review. Neither of these documents is a law. Both shaped the thinking that eventually became law, or at least became institutionalized policy around the world. In Australia, the governing framework for human research ethics is the National Statement on Ethical Conduct in Human Research, issued by the National Health and Medical Research Council, the NHMRC. The National Statement sets out the principles, the requirements, and the processes that govern research involving human participants at Australian institutions. And the key mechanism for implementing those requirements is the Human Research Ethics Committee, an HREC. Every university and research institution in Australia has one. Every research project that involves human participants must be reviewed and approved by an HREC before data collection begins. HRECs are not rubber stamps. They read proposals, they ask questions, they require modifications. They can refuse approval. And they're not composed only of researchers. By design, HRECs include people with no institutional stake in the research being approved: community members, ethicists, clergy, or counselors. The whole point is to introduce a perspective that isn't invested in the science getting done. This matters more than it might seem. Researchers want their projects to proceed. That's not a character flaw. It's a natural consequence of caring about what you're investigating. But it creates a risk that you rationalize borderline decisions in favor of your research. The HREC exists as a check on exactly that tendency. So when you submit an ethics application as a researcher, you're not just completing a formality. You're subjecting your reasoning to independent scrutiny by people whose job is to ask whether participants are genuinely protected. What does an HREC actually evaluate? The core question is always some version of, what could go wrong for the people in this study, and is that risk justified? The national statement identifies categories of risk that researchers must address. The most obvious is harm and distress, physical or psychological. Will participants be exposed to pain, to distressing material, to procedures that could leave them worse off than when they started? The key question isn't whether risk exists. Almost all research involves some, but whether the risk is proportionate to the expected benefit and whether it has been minimized as far as possible. And then there's confidentiality and privacy. Will data be collected that could identify participants? How will it be stored? Who will have access? What happens to identifying information after the study ends? This category matters differently in different research contexts. Clinical research with sensitive health data is scrutinized differently from an anonymous online survey, but it's always on the table. A third category is deception. Deliberately withholding information from participants or providing misleading information about the study's purpose. Deception exists on a spectrum, and it's worth examining more carefully, which we'll do in a moment. There's also the category of vulnerable populations, research involving children, people with cognitive impairments, prisoners, people experiencing acute mental illness, or others whose capacity to give truly free and informed consent may be compromised. The standard of protection is higher here, not because these people are less capable of contributing to science, but because the power imbalance is larger. And then there's a fourth category that comes up less often in psychology than in medicine, but that matters. Invasive procedures. These are research practices that physically alter participants in some way. Administering a drug or substance, inducing sleep deprivation, exposing someone to a painful stimulus, drawing blood. All of these cross a threshold that questionnaire research doesn't. The researcher is literally changing what's happening in someone's body. That raises the bar for justification considerably. And it makes explicit an obligation that's present everywhere, but sharpest here. If the research causes a negative effect, the researcher has a duty to correct it. That responsibility doesn't end when the session ends. Now, these categories aren't exhaustive, but they structure the way an HREC thinks about what could go wrong. Let's pause here. A researcher is studying stress responses in medical students during their first major clinical placement. She wants to collect daily cortisol samples and have students complete a mood questionnaire at the end of each shift. Students are not told the study is about stress. They're told it's about daily physiological patterns during clinical training. What ethical considerations does this study raise? At least three are in play. There is potential distress, given the population and context. There is deception, since students don't know the study's true focus. And there is a vulnerability consideration, since medical students during clinical placement may feel implicit pressure from their supervisors or institutions to participate. Each of these would need to be directly addressed in an HREC application, and the deception would need to be specifically justified. Deception deserves more than a mention in a list of risk categories because it occupies a genuinely complicated position in psychology. Some of the most important studies in the history of the field required deception to work. Take the bystander effect. The classic Darley and Latney experiments in the late 1960s showed that people are less likely to help in an emergency when other bystanders are present. Partly because of diffusion of responsibility, partly because people look to others to gauge how serious the situation is. Well, how did they demonstrate this? They told participants they were taking part in a discussion about adjustment to college life. The discussions happened over an intercom, with a participant apparently talking to other students. And one of those students, actually a recording, began to have what sounded like a seizure. The participant had no idea that was coming. They weren't told the study was about helping behavior. They thought someone might actually be in distress. That deception was essential to the study. If participants had known they were being tested on whether they would help, the result would have been meaningless. You're not studying bystander behavior, you're studying how people perform bystander behavior when they know they're being watched. So the question isn't whether deception is ever justified. In some research contexts, it clearly is. So the question is, when is it justified and under what conditions? Ethics guidelines, including the national statement, set out the logic. Deception is permissible if the study could not be conducted validly without it, the deception doesn't expose participants to harms that they would not have consented to if they had been told, and participants are debriefed fully after the session, given the opportunity to understand what the study was actually about, and given the right to withdraw their data once they know. Notice also what's not on the justified deception list. Convenience, or because the researcher didn't want to deal with demand characteristics. The real findings would be less clean is not sufficient justification. The bar is that the study couldn't be conducted without deception, not that it would have been harder or more expensive. Underneath all the specific rules, the HREC process, the risk categories, the deception conditions, there's a set of principles that the national statement treats as foundational. They're worth knowing not just to pass an exam, but because they give you the reasoning, not just the rules. Respect for persons means treating participants as autonomous agents capable of making their own decisions. It's the principle behind informed consent, the requirement that people know genuinely and in accessible language what they're agreeing to before they agree to it. Informed consent isn't a form. It's a process. The form is just its record. Beneficence and non-maleficence. Doing good and avoiding harm. These sound like obvious requirements, but in practice they require judgment. Research often involves some discomfort. The question is whether the potential benefit to participants, to society, to knowledge, justifies that discomfort, and whether unnecessary harm has been eliminated. Justice is about who bears the burden of research and who receives its benefits. Historically, this principle emerged from cases where vulnerable populations were recruited as research subjects, not because they were the right people to study, but because they were accessible and couldn't easily refuse, while the benefits of the resulting knowledge went to others. Justice asks, is participation in this research fairly distributed? And then there's integrity, not just honesty towards participants, but toward the scientific record. Fabricating data, suppressing inconvenient findings, misrepresenting methods, these aren't just ethical violations, they're a form of harm to the entire scientific enterprise and to everyone who relies on it. Those four are the philosophical scaffolding, but they translate into specific practical commitments that are worth naming directly. Take the right to withdraw. The national statement, following the Nuremberg Code, requires that participants can leave at any time. But notice the full meaning of that requirement. At any time without giving a reason. Not at any time provided they explain why. Not any time unless it's inconvenient. The right is unconditional. And the environment the researcher creates must make it genuinely exercisable. Recruitment materials that don't imply obligation. Procedures that don't make withdrawal feel costly. No questions that put participants on the defensive for wanting to stop. Related is the obligation of the researcher when things go wrong. If a participant experiences distress, discomfort, or any negative effect as a result of the research, the researcher's responsibility doesn't end when the session ends. They have a duty to address it, whether that means providing support information, extending the debrief, or following up afterward. Ethics covers what you do when something goes wrong, not just what you planned before it did. And then there's the specific meaning of debriefing, which carries more weight than many researchers initially appreciate. Debriefing is required to minimize harm, yeah, but when it's done, it's also genuinely educational for the people who participated. Participants who are told clearly what the study was actually about, why it was designed the way it was, and what it was trying to find out. Those participants leave with something real. They are entitled to ask questions, and they are entitled to have those questions answered to their satisfaction. That phrase, "to their satisfaction," is not just rhetoric. It means you don't deliver a short, canned explanation and end the session. It means you stay present, you answer what participants actually want to know, and you treat their curiosity as legitimate. The standard is easy to meet when participants are interested and things went smoothly. The test of it is whether you hold to it when a participant is frustrated or asks something you weren't expecting. Now here's the frame I'd like you to carry out of this video. Research ethics isn't a set of obstacles between you and your data. It's a design constraint, one that shapes research in the same way that methodological rigor shapes research. When you accept that you need informed consent, you design your recruitment materials differently. When you accept that deception requires debriefing, you design your procedure differently. When you accept that vulnerable populations require additional protections, you think differently about who you recruit and how. These constraints don't make science impossible. They make it trustworthy. And trust matters, not just for participants, but for the entire enterprise. Public confidence in psychological research rests partly on the understanding that human participants are genuinely protected. When high-profile cases of ethical failure make the news, they don't just damage the researchers involved, they damage the credibility of the field. So the HREC process, the forms, the application, those are the institution's mechanisms for enforcing a standard that researchers themselves should want to meet. The norm is this: you don't just avoid harm because the committee requires it. You avoid harm because participants are people, not data sources. With ethics covered, we're now ready to make the transition that defines the second half of this course. Up to this point, we've been working on the design side of research, how we construct studies, how we measure constructs, how we protect participants, how we justify causal claims. In the next video, we ask what happens once the data actually exist. You've collected your measures, you have your numbers, now what? That question is what statistics are for, and it turns out that answer is more interesting than most people expect. I'll see you there. Bye.